What's up, nerds? Ukraine has struck an early warning radar in Russia. The strike targeted a dual array radar in southern Russia using a drone. Images have been released showing damages to both radars. This marks the first strike that we've seen so far in this war targeting early warning radars that are part of Russia's nuclear defense infrastructure. And all of this is obviously a pretty big deal. Another strike reportedly targeted a similar radar in the city of Orsk, which is almost 2,000 kilometers away from the border with Ukraine. As of right now, which is May 27th, I've yet to see any kind of actual report on the damages to the radar, and we haven't really seen a lot of, thorough imaging on the radar since the strike. So for the purposes of this video, we're just gonna talk about the strike on Armavir, and really the principles of this video and what we're gonna be talking about remain the same no matter how many radars get hit. Now first, we're gonna talk about the Armavir radar station and what exactly it does and how it's part of Russia's nuclear defense infrastructure. We're gonna understand how and why it was hit. We're also going to talk about what might be coming next, what Russia's response might be. We also will talk about why this could be considered escalatory. What are the risks for Ukraine and what are the risks for the West in general with this kind of strike? And we're also going to ask the big question, will this strike lead to a nuclear war? Because believe it or not, we're kind of getting to that point, unfortunately. I don't know about you, but I'm not necessarily eager to test the realism of Fallout, unless of course it means I can get my hands on some sick NCR Ranger armor, and in that case I will sacrifice human civilization so I can wear that armor and wander around the wasteland. Now seriously though, what is this radar and why was it hit? The Voronezh DM radars located in Armavir represent Russia's best technology and latest technology in air defense and radar systems. First becoming operational in 2009, several other radar stations of older variations are being designated for replacement of the Voronezh design. And this is expected to take place sometime in the 2020s. However, surely the war in Ukraine has delayed this process by some amount of time. The two radars that were hit in Armavir by Ukraine were actually the second and third radars built of this series, the first radar being built in St. Petersburg. Now the two radars that were hit were oriented south, one oriented southeast towards Azerbaijan and the other oriented southwest towards Turkey. And both of them have a range of about 10,000 kilometers with a vertical range of about 8,000 kilometers. And they're really looking for any kind of incoming strategic threats, like incoming missiles, like cruise or ballistic missiles, anything that might have a nuclear warhead on it, as well as bombers and jets. And because of their long range, they're scanning not only, as far as they can actually point, their direct line of sight, but they're also checking the upper atmosphere as well. Now, both radars can track about 500 targets at a time, no smaller than the size of a football. So they're pretty powerful. Now, they're also incredibly expensive, and I'm not talking Five Guys burgers expensive. I'm talking about 4.5 billion rubles expensive. So actually, about 3 burgers at Five Guys. Now, being that they're radars, they're also incredibly sensitive. It doesn't take a lot of damage to cause really a capability kill on either one of these. Now, being that they're radars, they're also incredibly sensitive. You don't necessarily need to comprehensively destroy one of these radars to get a capability kill. Even minor damage can be a huge deal here. And I'm also going to try to put on my Perun hat here. I'm not going to do an Australian impression here, but I want to talk about the economics of this strike. Obviously, a drone worth about $10,000 hitting a 4 billion ruble radar, that's a pretty great trade. However, with sanctions, it might even take Russia more time to replace the parts that were damaged in this strike. So it's not only the cost that is incurred in this strike that Russia is going to suffer here, it's the loss of the capability. And it's the time that it's going to take for Russia to be able to get that capability operational again. A lot of those parts may come from countries like the United States, from Western countries. They might include, advanced chips and things that they may not necessarily be able to get a one-for-one replacement. And so in the meantime, they might have to turn to a country like China to get replacement parts. In that case, it might take them even longer to get these radars operational again. And that's just an assumption that these radars, require Western parts, but they very well may. In either case, the downtime will force Russia likely to pull some of its other advanced radar platforms from other places to provide some coverage in these areas. And that's not ideal because, again, they're diluting the radar coverage that they have in other areas that might include Ukraine to cover an area that they really weren't even supposed to have to cover. Now, Ukraine hasn't officially taken credit for this attack. However, it's more likely than not that it was in fact them, because who else would do it? Images that have been released from Russian Telegram channels appear to show damage to both radar towers, and boy, are they not happy. Some are talking about the use of a potential nuclear weapon in response to the strike, even for demonstration purposes. But before we get into that, why did Ukraine strike these radars? And what are the risks here? Now, we're going to start here with the risks here, and then we're going to talk about why Ukraine struck these radars. Now, the first and most obvious risk here is that Russia may choose to hit the nuclear button in response to this attack. And I'm not talking about like nuke everybody, nuke the world kind of option here, but a more limited option. For instance, Putin signed a decree in 2020 declaring that a strike on Russian nuclear defense infrastructure, including warning radars just like this, could warrant a nuclear response, and they would be perceived as a nuclear attack. Now, lucky for us, now we get to find out how much he actually means it. Another key strategic risk for Ukraine comes from actually the West with regards to these strikes. Mind you, the US and NATO allies are incredibly risk avoidant, especially with Russia and with this war. Nobody wants to see this war escalate past the nuclear threshold. There's open debate over whether or not NATO should allow Ukraine to use NATO-provided weapon systems in Russia. This has been a long-held conversation that's starting to build momentum, especially in the past several weeks. Platforms like ATACMS, like Storm Shadow, certainly have the capability to reach targets inside Russia. However, the US and the UK, who provide those platforms, have not granted them permission to do so. Part of the reason is that Russia has publicly threatened that if that decision was made and Ukraine could use those weapon systems in Russia, then Russia would have no choice but to strike the US and NATO in other parts of Europe where those weapon shipments are coming from to prevent them from getting to Ukraine. They're basically allowing the war to expand in scope outside of Ukraine. Now, thus far, it hasn't been allowed, and the pressure is growing. A clear example on why the pressure is growing here would be the Kharkiv offensive, which we've also talked about in a separate video. Ukraine had visibility into Belgorod and Sumy provinces where they were able to see the massing of forces on the Russian side of the border, and they knew that an attack was coming, and they had the capability to strike those forces. They just did not have permission to use that capability to strike those forces. And what we saw following that was the Russian invasion on parts of Kharkiv, where they were able to take a couple border cities. Now, luckily, that offensive appears to have been ground to a stop. However, there is the risk, of course, of Russia massing additional forces in Belgorod and Sumy and launching other cross-border attacks. Now, bringing it back to the attack on these two radar stations, the risk is that Ukraine might use Western-provided weapons on other parts of Russia's nuclear defense infrastructure. And that might send a message, whether Ukraine or the West means it or not, to Russia that the West is okay with Russia's nuclear defense infrastructure being degraded. And that is not good for anyone. And that concern alone might give the US and its other European allies providing weapons to Ukraine from giving Ukraine permission to use these weapon systems inside of Russia. Now, still though, Ukraine did it, and there are in fact some benefits to doing so. Of course, these two radar stations track strategic threats, but that can also impact some of the platforms that Ukraine is using, including ATACMS and the F-16s. This also follows a strike pattern through other parts of the front, throughout, parts of the occupied territory in Crimea, where Ukraine has managed to target and destroy S-300 and even S-400 systems, and that is opening up parts of the airspace. They've also been able to down several Russian jets in recent days. And all of this follows recent US aid packages to Ukraine, giving Ukraine more weapon systems to target these platforms. Now, this all might be part of a broader campaign within Ukraine to basically better enable Western-provided equipment to be used in Russia. It's easier and safer to use those platforms whenever you've at least partially blinded your enemy. And the mesh of Russian radars is not going to allow Ukraine to really fully blind Russia, but they can definitely create gaps and put up a type of fog. And by fog, I mean, you're preventing Russia from being able to see as far over the horizon as they were originally able to, and that would allow platforms like ATACMS or Storm Shadow or even F-16s to get closer to their targets before they're spotted and they can be intercepted. Now, I mentioned F-16s here, just kind of including them here. It's not like I wouldn't be holding my breath, at least, for these to completely blow the airspace wide open, but they're just an example. Now, long-range fires like ATACMS and Storm Shadow, however, can certainly create a lot of damage for Russian forces, especially as they mass forces in certain assembly areas for their summer offensive. If Russia is unable to mass forces and it's not able to assemble its forces for an attack, then it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to prosecute the summer offensive in the way that they would like to. Whether these two radar radar systems in Armavir or the radar system in Orsk are part of Russia's nuclear defense deterrent or not, it really doesn't matter. It's also part of their conventional defense, and targeting them can help Ukraine really prevent the summer from becoming the onslaught that it's expected to be. So now that Ukraine has done the deed, what does Russia think? More importantly, what is Russia going to do about it? Well, let's just say that they're not thrilled about this, and that is probably an understatement. Many Russian Telegram channels are openly calling for the detonation of a tactical nuclear weapon over Ukraine in a demonstration. Even not if they're not targeting Ukrainian forces. It's still the detonation of a nuclear weapon over the sovereign territory of another country. The U.S. has made it abundantly clear, even reportedly directly to the Russian government and Vladimir Putin, that the U.S. has told Russia basically that if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, then the U.S. will have no choice but to target Russian forces in Ukraine and destroy them and push them out of Ukraine. Which, that would be its own mess, but if I were Russia, I would probably listen to that. These strikes on these radar platforms put Putin into a pretty significant dilemma here. Does he make good on his decree that he signed in 2020, which means that a strike on any of these radar stations constitute a nuclear strike and warrant a nuclear response? Or does he pipe down in the face of the United States and make himself and Russia look weak? And this is, of course, the most important and the most fascinating part of this whole situation. And this is why Western outlets are largely freaking out so much. This is not the first time that we've seen nuclear threats from Russia. We've seen these going on for years now. And it should be noted that Russia does not necessarily view tactical nuclear weapons as part of the nuclear escalation chain the way that the United States does. They see tactical nuclear weapons as the top of the conventional escalation chain. Russia may also be prompted to respond or at least react based on the Western responses to the strike, which becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. For instance, if Western media, and I realize that I'm kind of playing into this a little bit just with this video, Western media claims that this is a big deal, and of course it is a big deal, and Russia responds as if they too believe that it's a big deal, which it is, then they can exploit Western fears over this issue. And they can do this in a way that might force the United States or other European countries to not give Ukraine the permission that it needs to use the weapon systems like ATACMS in Russia. Now, this could also have the inverse effect where they actually do give Ukraine the permission because Ukraine's actually in a pretty good position right now because of the strikes that they've carried out. Having taken out some pretty key Russian platforms and having received several different kinds of, capable long-range weapons from the West, they might be able to go open season inside Russia. Now, with all this being said, will this lead to nuclear war? Now, I don't think so, at least not yet. Despite the public rhetoric and what Russian trolls have been saying online, Russia does still fear some sort of a U.S. intervention, especially in Ukraine. If they didn't, then we probably would have seen a tactical nuke used probably over the Black Sea by now to force Ukraine back to the negotiation table and to accept something on Russian terms. Instead, they've restrained themselves, and for that they deserve credit because, of course, Russia still knows who their daddy is. However, if they feel threatened to the point that they believe that a NATO nuclear first strike is coming, and they feel that they have to launch a first strike to precipitate that, or even use a nuke in Ukraine just to kind of freeze everything and kind of reset politically where we are, then we are kind of getting into trouble here. Consider a nuclear detonation in or around Ukraine to be a moment where Russia is saying, okay, everybody stop, let's talk right now before we all kill ourselves. However, of course, this does carry the risk that the U.S. acts as advertised and targets Russian forces in Ukraine. And by this point, we're off to the races on the escalation ladder, and I will be preparing to don my NCR Ranger armor. But again, I don't think that we're there yet. Ukraine likely viewed the radars in Armavir through a conventional lens. After all, they're fighting a conventional war. They only have conventional capabilities, and they want to achieve conventional results. Russia is not wanting to escalate with the United States or anyone outside of Ukraine for that matter, and they may just be publicly acting tough to save face as they've done for, the years before this. They're not likely to do anything tremendously stupid. Putin and his military leadership, after all, they still kind of probably love being alive. And you can't have your Russian ethno-state without a habitable Moscow or St. Petersburg. So I'm not really thinking that I'm going to get my hands on NCR Ranger armor, and I'm actually happy that that's the case. And I'm also happy to get your thoughts on this issue in the comments below. So definitely do that. I want to know where you stand on this and what you think could be next. I've been seeing some really interesting comments in some of my past videos. You guys have been really having some really good conversations on there, sharing your thoughts, and I really appreciate that. So please definitely keep it up. I also like this video because it helps this video reach new audiences, and it really helps this channel grow. And subscribe for more analysis, not only on the war in Ukraine, but on other wars like, a potential conflict over Taiwan or the one in the Middle East. With all that, I'll see y'all later. Bye.